They accused him of hoarding and told him to leave. He left. Then the horses started dying, and they came looking for the man they'd driven off their own land, the one who'd told them exactly what was coming. He'd written it all down in his ledger. Caleb Winslow sat at a rough pine table in the half-dark of a Montana morning, the leather-bound ledger open beneath his hands, brass clasp catching the single flame of a tallow candle. His thumb moved down the column on the left. Dates. His pale, gray-blue eyes tracked right. Weights, moisture readings, crib numbers. Every load of hay he'd cut in 3 seasons lived in that book. 42 tons of cured grass hay, stacked on raised timber cribs behind his barn, each section separated by 8 inches of open air so the wind could move through and pull moisture out before it settled. Canvas stretched over the tops, weighted with river stones he'd hauled up from the creek by sledge. He'd numbered the cribs 1 through 19. He'd recorded the weight of every load. He'd pressed his fist into the center of each section and written down what he felt. Dry, slightly warm, no rot, no mold. 160 acres northwest of Oxbow, Montana Territory. That's what Caleb Winslow had. A modest cabin with 2 rooms, chinking that needed another coat before December. A solid barn, 16 by 32 feet, log walls, a plank roof he'd tarred the previous spring for $220 he couldn't really afford. And behind that barn, a hay yard that looked like it belonged to a man running 5 times his herd. The cribs stood in 2 long rows, 8 on one side, 11 on the other, the gap between them wide enough for a wagon to pass through. From a distance, it looked like a small fort. Up close, it looked like obsession. It was obsession. And it had a reason. 3 years earlier, winter of '84, a late-season storm sealed the valley around Oxbow for 19 days straight. Snow packed so hard against the passes that even the mail couldn't move. Caleb had put up a reasonable amount of hay that year, enough for a normal winter. 60, maybe 70 days of supplemental feed. The storm ate through it in 12. On day 13, he started pulling bark off cottonwoods for his draft horses. By day 15, he was dragging dead cattle out of snowdrifts with a rope over his shoulder because the horses were too weak to pull. He lost 11 head, came within 2 days of losing both percherons. His wife had been gone 14 months by then. There was nobody to help him dig. He swore on the last dead calf that it would never happen again. So he cut hay. He cut it in June when the grass was tall and the sugar content peaked. He cut it in July after the second growth came in along the creek bottom. He cut it in August from leased meadows 2 miles south that nobody else bothered with. He cured it on the ground, raked it, forked it onto the cribs, covered it, weighed it, and wrote it all down. 3 full seasons, 42 tons. His ledger showed a feed calculation on the inside back cover, updated every time he added or subtracted an animal. At current head count, 31 cattle, 2 draft horses, 1 saddle horse, and a mule, he had feed for 147 days. 147 days. He'd underlined the number twice. Now here's the thing. Autumn of 1887 was beautiful, suspiciously beautiful. October came in warm, the grass still green in the lower pastures, the creek running easy, the cottonwoods barely starting to turn. Most ranchers around Oxbow had put up modest hay, enough for a normal winter, 60 to 90 days of supplemental feed. The same gamble Caleb had made in '84. The same gamble almost everybody makes when the weather is kind and the arithmetic feels generous. Nobody was worried. Nobody except the man with the ledger. Garrett Hale noticed the hay yard on a Tuesday. He was riding the north road that cuts past Caleb's fence line. A big man on a big horse, charcoal wool coat buttoned to his thick neck, that black felt hat with the sweat-stained band sitting square on his steel-gray hair. 600 head on open range, largest operation in the valley. Hale had been ranching the Oxbow Basin since before the town had a name, and he carried himself like a man who owned the ground beneath other people's boots. Thumbs hooked into his belt, chin lifted, dark brown eyes already done listening before you started talking. He reined up, looked at the cribs, counted them. Then he rode into town and stood at the counter of the general store and said what he'd been thinking the entire ride. "That boy's sitting on enough hay to feed every horse in the territory, and he won't sell a blade of it. That's not careful. That's greed." 12 men heard it. By sundown, 30 knew. The pressure started small. A neighbor rode up, friendly enough, asking if Caleb might sell 10 loads at market rate. Caleb opened the ledger, ran his finger down the column, and said no. "I've got feed calculated for 147 days at current head count. I'm not selling days I might need." The neighbor left, annoyed. A second came the next week, offering above market rate, nearly double. Same answer, same ledger, same quiet refusal. A third didn't ask. He told Caleb he was being a damn fool and that the valley needed that hay distributed, not hoarded by one man sitting on 160 acres like a dragon on a pile of gold. The general store owner started calling it a community problem. A petition went around, nothing legal, just a sheet of paper with names on it, asking Caleb Winslow to sell his surplus at fair price for the good of the valley. 23 signatures. Then Garrett Hale finished it. He stood on the porch of the general store on a Thursday afternoon, hat in one hand, the other hand flat on the railing, and told every man assembled that Caleb Winslow was bleeding this valley dry. That hoarding feed while your neighbors went short wasn't ranching. It was something a man ought to be ashamed of. And if Winslow wouldn't share, then Winslow didn't belong here. The crowd agreed, every last one of them. Caleb watched from across the street. His dark brown hair fell past his ears, the faint freckles on his cheekbones catching the late afternoon light. He closed the ledger. The brass clasp clicked shut. He tucked it into his left coat pocket, turned without a word, and walked toward the livery stable. Caleb loads a single pack mule in the pre-dawn dark, his breath visible in the cold, the ledger tucked inside his coat. No lamp, no lantern, just the gray suggestion of light along the eastern ridge and the sound of his own hands working buckles and cinch straps in the silence. He doesn't slam a door. He doesn't curse anyone's name. He ties a bedroll behind the saddle, lashes a canvas tool wrap across Dutch's pack frame, and checks the provisions. Flour, salt pork, coffee, a tin of lard, dried beans, matches, a coil of 16-gauge wire. Enough for 2 weeks if he's careful. Maybe 18 days if the hunting's decent. Before he mounts, he walks back to the cabin door and nails a single sheet of paper to the frame with a horseshoe nail. The note is written in the same tight, slanted hand that fills every page of that leather-bound ledger with the brass clasp. It reads, "Help yourselves to the well. Don't touch the hay. It's calculated." That's it. No anger, no threat, no plea. Just a man who did the math, got told the math was wrong by people who never opened a ledger in their lives, and decided to let the weather settle the argument. He swings up onto his saddle horse, takes Dutch's lead rope, and rides south toward the timber breaks without looking back at Oxbow. Now here's what nobody in that valley noticed at dawn. Nobody except one person. Lorna Calloway stood at her fence line on the eastern edge of the valley, both hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee gone lukewarm, and watched Caleb's silhouette move across the flat. She didn't wave. He didn't see her. But she watched until he disappeared into the dark fold of the cottonwood bottoms along Sutter Creek, and then she stood there another full minute, staring at the empty space where he'd been. Lorna had been alone on that homestead for 18 months. Her husband, Thomas Calloway, died of pneumonia the spring before last, went from a cough to a coffin in 11 days. She was 34 years old, slim and wiry, about 5 feet 6 inches, with dark auburn hair pulled back in a loose braid that hung past her shoulder blades, a few strands always escaping around her temples. Hazel green eyes, slightly wide set, a small cluster of 3 faint freckles on the right side of her jaw. Her hands were never still, always gripping a fence rail, wrapping wire, scrubbing a surface. She was the only person in Oxbow who did not sign the petition against Caleb Winslow, and she had her own ledger, kept it in a tin box on her kitchen shelf, next to the brass thimble on a leather cord she wore tucked inside her collar. 14 tons of hay on a single raised crib, morning temperatures, evening temperatures, feed consumed per head per day. She ran 9 cattle and 2 draft horses, and she knew to the pound what each one needed to survive until April. 12 miles south, Caleb found his draw. A sheltered fold in the timber breaks where a limestone shelf blocked the northwest wind and a spring-fed creek still ran clear. He set camp tight, canvas lean-to against the rock face, fire ring with a reflector wall of stacked deadfall, Dutch and the saddle horse picketed on good grass along the creek. By noon, he was cutting timber for fence rails, not because he needed fence rails right now, because idle hands in a place like this will kill you faster than cold ever could. Every evening, he opened that ledger. Ambient temperature at dawn, 41 degrees. Ambient temperature at dusk, 36. Wind direction, northwest shifting to north after dark. And one entry that nobody would have thought to write, Dutch turned hindquarters northwest at approximately 5:15. He wrote it every single night. That mule's instinct was data, same as a thermometer, maybe better. Back in Oxbow, the warm October kept on lying to everyone. Garrett Hale, steel gray hair combed back, dark brown eyes small and deep-set beneath those bushy brows that nearly met in the center, stood in front of the general store with his wide-brimmed black felt hat in one hand and his thumbs hooked into his belt, telling anyone who'd listen that the season was proving him right. 52 years old, barrel-chested, chin lifted like always, a man accustomed to being the biggest voice in any room. Several of his men rode out to Caleb's ranch and inspected the hay yard. They walked the rows. They lifted the canvas edges and looked underneath. The hay was perfect. Dry, golden, tight-stacked on raised cribs with 8 inches of airflow beneath each section. Not a trace of mold, not a whiff of rot. They spent 2 hours arguing about how to divide it and couldn't agree on terms. One man wanted it by herd size. Another wanted it by seniority. Garrett wanted first cut because Garrett always wanted first cut. Nobody touched it. The hay sat exactly where Caleb had stacked it, under its canvas covers, preserved by a system none of them understood and all of them wanted the benefit of. If you've made it this far into Caleb's story, stay with me, because what happens next is the part that shut every one of those men up. Elsa McEwen saw it all. She was 68 years old, petite, white hair pinned in a tight bun with 2 tortoiseshell pins, and she sat on her porch with her brass-handled hickory cane across her lap, watching those men argue over another man's hay like dogs circling a bone they didn't bury. She kept 2 goats and a small garden, ran nothing, owed nothing, and feared nothing. The store clerk walked past her porch carrying a sack of flour, and Elsa said exactly one thing. That hay isn't yours to divide, and this weather isn't yours to predict. The clerk kept walking. Elsa's pale blue eyes stayed on the foothills. November 2nd. Snow came in sideways off the northwest ridge, heavy, wet, and 2 weeks earlier than anyone expected. 14 inches in 18 hours. The valley went white before dawn and stayed white. Garrett Hale's open-range cattle scattered across the foothills with no shelter, no supplemental feed staged, no plan. He stood on his porch, that black felt hat pulled low, and looked out at the white nothing burying his confidence. First snowfall blankets the valley, heavy, wet, and 2 weeks earlier than anyone expected. Garrett Hale looks up from his porch and says nothing. By November 9th, the snow has not melted. A second storm drops another 11 inches on top of the first, and the temperature falls to 4 below zero. Wind out of the northwest holds steady at 22 miles per hour, gusting to 38, and it drives the snow into a hard crust across every open pasture in the valley. That crust is the killer. Not the cold, not the wind, the crust. Because a cow can paw through 6 inches of loose powder to reach dormant grass. A cow cannot paw through a frozen plate of compressed ice an 1.5 inches thick. She'll try for an hour, maybe 2, standing with her head down and her front hoof scraping, and then she'll stop. She'll just stand there, and she'll start burning through her own body fat to stay alive. Garrett Hale knows this. Give the man that much. He's not stupid about cattle. He stands on his porch, that wide-brimmed black felt hat pulled low over those bushy gray eyebrows, thumbs hooked into his belt, and he watches his hands start hauling hay to 600 head scattered across 3,000 acres of open range. His reserves sit in 2 long rows behind his main barn, bales stacked on bare ground, covered with loose canvas tarps weighted at the corners with rocks. He does the arithmetic standing right there on that porch, and the arithmetic is brutal. 600 head at roughly 35 pounds of hay per day per animal. That's 21,000 pounds a day. Call it 10.5 tons. His reserves total somewhere around 420 tons, and that sounds like a lot until you divide. 40 days, maybe 42 if he cuts rations early. 40 days to get through a winter that hasn't even started yet. And here's the thing Garrett doesn't know, because he never checked. His bottom bales are already rotting. Those tarps he threw over the stacks? They shed rain fine. They also trap moisture underneath. Condensation forms on the inside surface of the canvas, drips back down into the hay, and pools at the base where the bales sit directly on frozen ground. The bottom 2 layers of every stack are showing white mold threading through the stems. Not visible from the outside, not yet, but the nutritional value of those bales is dropping by the day, and when his men finally pull from the bottom of the stack in December, they'll find hay that cattle won't eat. Hay that smells like wet newspaper, hay that's worthless. Caleb's system is different, and the difference is geometry. His raised cribs lift every bale 8 inches off the ground on a framework of peeled lodgepole pine. Air circulates underneath. Moisture from the frozen earth never contacts the hay. Between each vertical section of stacked bales, he leaves an 8-inch gap. Not for convenience, but for airflow. Those gaps allow dry winter air to pass through the stack, pulling moisture out of the hay instead of trapping it in. His canvas covers are weighted with flat stones along the top edges, but left open along the bottom 6 inches on the leeward side. Snow sheds off the angled surface. Air moves in from below, up through the gaps, and out through the open bottom edge on the opposite side. The stack breathes. It stays dry. Every bale, top to bottom, comes out clean and bright when you cut the twine. Across the valley, the crisis compounds. Ranchers cut feed portions by 1/3, then by half. Horses lose weight first because horses always lose weight first. Their ribs show within 2 weeks, hip bones jutting like knuckles under hide. Cattle follow. The general store in town runs low on grain by mid-November. A delegation of 4 men rides 47 miles east to the next settlement and returns 5 days later with 6 tons of hay purchased at triple the autumn price. $18 per ton instead of 6. 6 tons. That's not even 1 day's feed for Hale's operation alone. It's a gesture. It's men pretending they're solving a problem they can't solve. If you've made it this far into Caleb's story, stay with me, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Caleb Winslow sits alone in his camp in the timber breaks south of the valley, and he records everything. That leather-bound ledger with the brass clasp is open on his knee every morning and every evening. November 14th, dawn, 11 below zero. Firewood consumed overnight, 1 1/4 armloads. Firewood remaining in the split pile, approximately 116 armloads. At current burn rate, 93 days of fuel. Dutch the mule, that ugly, stubborn, magnificent animal, turns his hindquarters to the northwest again at mid-morning. A 3rd storm is coming. Caleb writes it down. He writes everything down, but he is not comfortable. His shelter is a canvas lean-to braced against a rock face, and on the night of November 14th, the smoke problem nearly drives him out into the cold. His fire pit sits at the base of the rock wall, and the wall above it is smooth and slightly concave. Smoke pools against the stone, rolls back down and fills the lean-to until his eyes burn and his chest aches. He cannot sleep in smoke. He will die in smoke. So he fixes it. He takes a hand chisel and a camp hammer, and he chips a narrow groove into the rock face above the fire pit, angling it upward. His first attempt runs too wide at the opening, 4.5 inches across, and it channels smoke upward but also pulls cold outside air downward into the shelter. The fire gutters. The lean-to fills with a different kind of misery, clean air, but freezing. He packs the groove's upper opening with clay and gravel, narrowing it to just under 3 inches. The second attempt works. Smoke draws upward through the groove and dissipates against the outer rock face. The fire burns cleaner. His eyes stop watering. He records the final dimensions: 4 inches wide at the base, narrowing to 3 at the exit, 22 inches long, angled at 32 degrees. 12 miles north, Lorna Calloway has been watching the valley come apart. Her own 14 tons of hay, stored on a raised crib she built with her own hands the previous summer, is holding perfectly. 19 head of cattle. At current feed rates, 71 days of supply remaining. But Lorna has also been counting other people's cattle and other people's hay. The numbers are on a piece of paper now, written on both sides in her careful hand. The valley's total remaining feed against the valley's total livestock. The math does not work. It does not come close to working. Lorna Calloway saddles her horse in the dark and rides south toward the timber breaks. She carries a lantern, a sack of flour, and a folded piece of paper with numbers written on both sides. The lantern light found him before she did. It caught the edge of Dutch's gray flank, where the mule stood tethered beneath a stand of lodgepole pine, and the animal turned its broad head toward the glow without alarm. Dutch knew the horse, had smelled it on the wind a quarter-mile back and done nothing. No stamping, no bray, no flattened ears. That told Lorna everything she needed to know about whether Caleb Winslow was still alive. She came through the timber breaks at dawn on November 16th, following mule tracks through fresh snow that was already 6 inches deep and still falling. The tracks were clean and deliberate. Dutch had walked a straight line from the creek to the camp, which meant Caleb had led him, not ridden him. A man who walks his mule through timber in the dark is a man who is paying attention to the ground beneath his feet. His camp was spare, a fire ring built against a rock shelf that reflected heat forward. A canvas lean-to angled to shed wind from the northwest. Hay stacked on a fallen log to keep it off the snow. Caleb sat beside the fire with his leather-bound ledger open on one knee, the brass clasp catching firelight, his pale, gray-blue eyes lifting to meet hers without surprise. That 2-day stubble had grown to maybe 4 days. The faded, oatmeal-colored wool coat hung open despite the cold, and his dark brown canvas work shirt beneath it was stained at the cuffs with pitch from cutting lodgepole. Lorna Calloway did not ask him to come back. She did not apologize on behalf of the valley. She did not say Garrett Hale's name. She pulled the folded piece of paper from inside her dark, slate-blue wool dress, smoothed it flat against her thigh, and set it on a rock beside his fire. "Total valley livestock," she said, "approximately 1,400 head. Total remaining hay across all ranches excluding yours, roughly 38 tons." She paused. The fire popped. "Your 42 tons on raised cribs is more than the rest of the valley combined." Caleb looked at the paper, then at her, then back at the paper. "I'm not asking you to save them," Lorna said. "I'm showing you the arithmetic." That sentence sat between them like a stone in still water. He picked up the paper, read it without speaking. The numbers were written in a tight, precise hand. Columns for each ranch, estimated head counts, hay reserves, days of feed remaining. Some ranches showed single digits. 2 showed 0. Then Caleb opened his own ledger and turned it toward her. 42 tons on raised cribs. Estimated loss to moisture and vermin at roughly 4%. He'd checked 3 cribs himself 2 days ago, pulled sample bales, weighed them against his original measurements, leaving approximately 40 usable tons. At emergency ration rates, 1,400 head could eat for 26 days. At managed ration rates with supplemental grazing, where wind had blown snow clear of grass, maybe 35 days. He wrote the number 35 at the bottom of the page and underlined it. One clean line beneath the ink. That was the conversation. Now here's the part I need you to sit with, because what happened next wasn't dramatic. Nobody confessed anything. Nobody reached across the fire. What happened was logistics, and if you've made it this far into Caleb's story, stay with me, Because the way two people fall in love over arithmetic is the quietest thing in the world, and it's the truest. Lorna sat down on the other side of the fire. She pulled a tin cup from her saddlebag and set it on a flat rock beside the flames without comment. 2 tin cups now, his battered one with the bent handle already sitting on a stone to the left, hers on the right. She didn't mention it. He didn't look at it, but it was there. They calculated feed schedules, distribution routes, which ranchers sat closest to Caleb's hay cribs, which ones would need sledge delivery through the timber, which ones had surviving reserves that could stretch another week without help. Caleb's ledger tracked weight, temperature, moisture, good data, clean entries. Lorna's ledger was better. She recorded not just weight and temperature, but wind direction at dawn and dusk, animal behavior, when her horse refused grain, when the barn cats moved to higher shelves, when the creek changed pitch. Cloud formations sketched in the margins, barometric pressure estimated by the ache in her left wrist, broken 2 winters back and never properly set. Caleb read her entries and said nothing for a long time. Then he turned to a blank page in his own ledger and copied her column headers. That was the courtship, right there. A man copying a woman's column headers by firelight because her system was better than his. He agreed to return, not to forgive. Forgiveness wasn't in the arithmetic. The hay doesn't care who owns it, Caleb said. It cares about moisture and weight. They broke camp. He loaded Dutch with careful hands, checking the mule's hooves, adjusting the pack frame. Lorna's horse and Caleb's mule walked side by side through the timber, shoulder to shoulder, breath fogging in matched rhythm. The ride back took 3 hours through country that looked like the world had been erased and redrawn in white. Snow sat heavy on every branch, and the silence was so deep you could hear individual flakes landing on canvas. Caleb rode with that perpetual forward lean, shoulders rounded, scanning the ridgeline. Halfway down the north slope, he pointed without speaking. Elk. A herd of maybe 40, moving to lower ground along a draw that fed into the main valley. 2 days early for that migration pattern. Lorna nodded. She'd seen the same drift from her homestead the evening before, animals abandoning high ground ahead of schedule. A third storm was building. Dutch already knew. The mule had been walking with its ears pinned flat since they left the timber. They crested the ridge above Oxbow and looked down at the valley. Smoke rose from chimneys across the settlement, thin gray columns against a white sky. But Garrett Hale's main barn sat dark. No heat shimmer, no smoke. His stovepipe coupling had frozen shut, iron meeting iron without insulation, exactly the kind of cold bridge failure that happens when a man trusts experience over engineering. Caleb noted it. His expression didn't change. There was no satisfaction in watching a frozen pipe prove a point that shouldn't have needed proving. They rode down toward the valley in silence. The snow kept falling. Dutch walked steady, and below them, the smoke rose from every chimney but one. Caleb rides into Oxbow on November 17, 1887, at mid-morning. Nobody speaks to him. Every eye follows him down the frozen main street to the general store. A woman pulls her shawl tighter and turns her back. The blacksmith stops mid-swing and just watches. 2 men on the porch of the feed office look right through him like he's a ghost riding a mule, and maybe that's what they hoped he'd become. A ghost. A problem that solved itself out there in the cold. He doesn't stop in town. Dutch carries him the last 3 miles home at a steady walk, ears forward, hooves cracking through the frozen crust of the trail like pistol shots in the silence. And when he crests the rise and sees his place laid out below him, the cabin, the barn, the hay yard, something tight in his chest loosens for the first time in weeks. Everything is untouched. Every single thing. The cabin door is shut. The barn doors are latched. The hay yard sits exactly as he left it, every canvas cover in place, every stone weight positioned on its corner. The note he'd nailed to the cabin door before he left, a simple thing saying he'd return and to help themselves to the well if needed, is still there. Weathered now, curled at the edges, ink bleeding into illegibility. Nobody tore it down. Nobody took him up on it either. The well bucket hangs dry on its hook. The community didn't just freeze him out. They froze themselves out of his resources, too. That's spite dressed up as principle, and it damn near cost people their lives. Caleb swings down from Dutch, hooks his thumbs into his suspender straps, and stands there with that slight forward lean of his, pale gray-blue eyes moving across his operation like a man reading a page. Then he walks straight to the hay yard and starts pulling canvas. The raised cribs on the south and west sides are clean. Hay at the bottom of each stack is dry to the touch, the 8-inch gap between the lowest bales and the frozen ground doing exactly what he designed it to do, letting cold air circulate beneath instead of trapping moisture against the hay. He pulls bales from the center of each stack, breaks them open, presses his face into the cut side, and breathes deep. Dry, sweet, good. The north crib tells a different story. Snow has drifted hard against the base, packing itself between the crib legs and wicking moisture upward through the bottom 2 layers, like water climbing a wick. He can smell it before he even pulls the canvas back. That sour, warm stink of mold just starting to bloom. The bottom bales are damp, dark along their edges, and when he breaks one open, the interior is gray-green where it should be gold. Roughly 1.5 tons of hay compromised, maybe 30 head of cattle fed for a week, gone. He doesn't curse, doesn't kick anything, just pulls every damp bale out and stacks them in a line outside the yard where the wind will freeze dry what it can and ruin what it can't. Then he opens that leather-bound ledger with its brass clasp and writes, "North crib failure. Snowdrift wicked moisture through base layers. No deflection barrier on north exposure. Approximately 1.5 tons lost." The fix comes to him the way fixes always do, not as inspiration but as geometry. A low-angled wall of stacked fence rails and packed snow set 6 feet out from the crib's north base at a 60-degree batter. Not a wall that blocks snow, a wall that catches the ground-level drift and kicks it sideways before it can pile against the legs. He builds it in 4 hours. Lorna holds the rails while he drives the stakes. She shows up without being asked, her dark auburn braids swinging against her back, sleeves of that slate-blue dress rolled to her elbows despite the cold. Neither of them comments on the arrangement. It simply happens. 2 people doing work that needs doing, and if their gloved hands brush passing a rail, neither one mentions that either. Now here's where the hay distribution begins, and here's where Caleb proves every damn person in that valley wrong. He opens his hay yard, but on his terms. Every rancher receives a calculated ration based on head count, verified by Caleb and Lorna together at his kitchen table with both ledgers open. Roughly 22 pounds per day for cattle, 18 for horses, adjusted for body weight. Every number written down, every calculation shown. Ranchers file through that cabin one by one, and most of them can't meet his eyes. Garrett Hale arrives last. He stands in the doorway of Caleb's cabin, that wide-brimmed black hat held in one thick hand against his barrel chest, windburn bright across his broad nose. He says, "How much per head?" Caleb tells him. Hale nods once and accepts without argument. That's what humility looks like when it's been dragged there by necessity. Here's the thing about Caleb Winslow that nobody in that valley understood until it was almost too late. He wasn't hoarding hay. He was hoarding time. The distribution system is elegant in its simplicity. A plank balanced on a fence post, a 50-pound anvil from his forge as counterweight on one end. Every ration weighed before it leaves the yard. Every transaction recorded in his ledger. Date, recipient, pounds distributed, remaining reserve. Lorna maintains a parallel record. Every evening they compare by lamplight at his kitchen table. 2 cups of coffee, 2 ledgers, 2 chairs pulled close enough that their elbows nearly touch. The brass thimble on its cord catches the lamplight when she leans forward to check a figure. Neither of them names this. Neither of them needs to. On November 21st, Dutch turns northwest at noon and refuses to leave the barn. The brown and white ranch collie whines at the door and will not step outside. Elk vanish from the ridgeline like they were never there. Caleb checks his ledger's weather column and writes, "Third storm. Worse than the first two. Dutch turned at noon. 6 hours earlier than the last time. The third storm hits at 2 a.m. on November 22nd. Wind gusts reach 58 miles per hour. The temperature drops to 29 below zero." Caleb is in his barn, checking the hay cribs by lantern light, when the first gust tears a section of canvas loose. He grabs it, lashes it down, and opens his ledger to a fresh page. The wind tears canvas loose from the north hay crib, and Caleb lashes it down in the dark, his hands numb inside leather gloves, while Lorna braces a lantern against the barn wall to give him light. The gust hits 58 miles an hour, and the canvas snaps like a rifle shot, but he holds it, wraps the tie down twice around the post, and cinches it with a knot he can feel but cannot see. Inside the barn, the thermometer reads 31 degrees. Outside, it is 29 below zero. That is a 60-degree difference across 8 inches of log wall, banked earth, and the body heat of 11 cattle standing shoulder to shoulder on dry bedding. The deflection wall on the north side is doing exactly what it was designed to do, shedding the drift northwest, away from the hay cribs, away from the barn entrance. Snow piles 4 feet deep against the wall's upwind face and slides off at 58 degrees instead of 60 because the frozen ground forced the angle slightly off true. It does not matter. The hay stays dry. The cribs hold. But at 2:30 in the morning, the water trough goes silent. Caleb finds the problem by lantern light. The iron-to-iron coupling where his supply pipe meets the trough has no insulation wrap. A cold bridge. The exact flaw the inspector would have caught. He packs the joint with straw and rawhide soaked in tallow, binds it tight, and waits. Water flows again by dawn. Now, Garrett Hale. Let me tell you how experience without adaptation looks when the bill comes due. His main barn loses 2 sections of shingle before midnight. Wind gets under the exposed decking and peels it back like skin off a knuckle. His hay, stored on bare ground under loose tarps because that is how Garrett Hale has always stored hay, and nobody was going to tell him different, soaks through and freezes into a single, useless block. 14 head of cattle die overnight, not from disease, not from wolves, from exposure. From cold that a deflection wall and raised cribs and 8 inches of airflow would have stopped. His stovepipe freezes shut. The man who stood in Caleb's hay yard and called the work foolish sits in his kitchen in the dark, wrapped in a blanket, wide-brimmed black hat on the table beside him, and waits for daylight. That is what certainty buys you when it is not backed by numbers. Morning breaks gray and still. Caleb and Lorna distribute emergency hay from the yard. The weighing system holds even now. Lorna marks each bale on her ledger. Caleb marks his. 26 tons remain. At current distribution rates, that is 18 more days of feed for every animal in the cooperative. Caleb writes the number on a fresh line in that leather-bound ledger with the brass clasp and circles it once. The valley has survived the worst night anyone can remember, but winter is not finished. It never is. 3 days later, a territorial livestock inspector rides in from Helena. A man named Aldrich, sent after reports of catastrophic losses across the upper valley. He walks Caleb's hay yard with a measuring tape and a notebook of his own. Crib heights, 7 feet 4 inches at the tallest point. Spacing between sections, 8 inches, enough for a hand to fit through and check for heat. Deflection wall angle, 58 degrees. Aldrich writes it all down without comment. Then he asks to see the ledger. Caleb hands it over. The inspector reads in silence for 10 minutes. Morning temperatures, evening temperatures, firewood consumed, hay distributed, moisture readings, trough water levels, days of isolation remaining. He closes the ledger and looks at Caleb, at those pale gray-blue eyes, the crooked nose, the 2-day stubble, the slight forward lean of a man who has spent his whole life walking into wind. He says, "This is the most complete feed management record I have seen in the territory." He does not smile. He opens his own notebook and writes his report. If you have made it this far into Caleb's story, stay with me, because this next part is the one I have been waiting to tell you. Garrett Hale comes back. Not to apologize. He stands at the edge of Caleb's hay yard, that charcoal wool coat buttoned to his throat, dark brown eyes small and deep-set beneath those bushy gray brows, thumbs hooked into his belt. He asks one question. "How far off the ground did you set the cribs?" Caleb answers, 14 inches on the south side, 18 on the north where the grade drops. Hale nods. "And the spacing between sections?" 8 inches, enough for a hand to fit through and check for heat. Hale nods again. He turns and walks back to his horse. He will rebuild his storage that spring using the same dimensions. He will never say thank you. He does not need to. Elsa McEwen sees it before anyone else. She is standing near the hay yard gate, hickory cane in her right hand, white hair pinned tight beneath those tortoiseshell pins, pale blue eyes sharp as ever. Caleb and Lorna are comparing their ledgers side by side, his leather-bound, hers a canvas-covered notebook, and Lorna has set her tin cup on the fence post next to his. Elsa watches for a long moment, then she says, "She brought her own cup." That is all I needed to see. Neither Caleb nor Lorna reacts. They do not need to either. The homestead absorbs Lorna's operation the way a creek absorbs a tributary, gradually, without announcement. First her tools migrate into his barn, then her ledger sits beside his on the kitchen table, then her horse stands in his stall. The cabin grows from 2 rooms to 4. A porch is added facing southeast to catch the morning sun. The hay yard expands to hold 60 tons on 12 cribs. Dutch the mule grows old and stiff in the joints and is replaced by a younger mule with the same stubborn hindquarters, the same instinct for turning northwest when the pressure drops. Years later, silver hair, a wider porch, 2 ledgers still open on the kitchen table every evening. The deflection wall on the north side is gray with lichen. That younger mule turns northwest in the October wind. 2 chairs on the porch, 2 cups by the stove, a hand held at sunset. The wall is still standing. So are they.